from the Nest Centre in London, and welcome to our midweek briefing. I'm John Lough, the head of foreign policy. We're focusing today on Russia's reaction to last week's NATO summit. This did not turn out to be the debacle that many had feared. Let's recall that in 2018, President Trump was on the verge of withdrawing the US from the alliance in the apparent belief that it was simply not worth the investment from the United States. And if you read the memoirs of the then National Security Advisor, John Bolton, it seems that Trump went into the meeting of the heads of state and government thinking about genuinely pulling the US out of NATO. And Bolton and his colleagues just really didn't know what the US president was about to do. So this time the summit was kept to the absolute minimum, and some sycophantic messages, and I'm sorry to use that word here, but I think it's appropriate, from the Secretary General put Trump in a good mood. And the member states signed up to a commitment to raise defense spending to 5%. So if fulfilled, this pledge will double NATO countries' defense spending within a decade, and it will, of course, lead to the majority of European NATO member states rearming. And one can say, at one level, Trump appears to have succeeded where many other US presidents failed, because even when I worked at NATO, which is over 25 years ago, this subject was always in the air about how much the Europeans were paying in relation to the Americans. And Robert Gates, who was the defense secretary from 2006, 2011, under both Bush and Obama, he famously wrote that trying to get the NATO member states, the European member states, to do anything about this was like shouting down a well. So Trump has definitely managed to move things in a really quite significant way. To discuss Russia's reading of the summit, we're very pleased to have with us Pavel Luzin. Pavel is a senior fellow with the Democratic Resilience Program at the Centre for European Policy Analysis, CEPA. And he's also a senior fellow with the relatively recently created Saratoga Foundation. So welcome, Pavel. It's great to have you with us. And I should say that Pavel's focus is on Russian foreign policy and defense. He's previously worked for Alexei Navalny's presidential campaign at that time, as well as for Freedom House. And before that, he was a lecturer at Perm State University. So Pavel, thank you very much for joining us. We're going to jump straight in. And my question to you is, what has been the reaction in Moscow to the outcome of the NATO summit? Was the outcome pretty much as expected, do you think, from Moscow's perspective?
Good morning, John. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. So, towards the Moscow's reaction, you know, there are two reactions. One reaction of the professional expert community, like, I know, Institute of World Economy and International Relations at Russian Academy of Sciences, or some other think tanks in Russia. I think they were not surprised. The second reaction, the reaction of political establishment, business establishment, and common people. This reaction may be a kind of disappointment, because you know, they were expecting that Donald Trump would be a troublemaker for the United States, troublemaker for US allies, troublemaker for NATO, and so on and so on. But they realized that America is not going to withdraw from NATO, that America commits to its ally obligations. We saw this in Israeli-Iran war recently. And America just wants to share the burden of defense spending. The current American administration likes contributors and hates free riders. And that's it.
Yeah, well, that is a good summary. I'm sorry, I need to say to our viewers that if you have a question or a comment, please put it in the chat and I will endeavor to come to you. But Putin gave a long response to what was effectively a planted question on the margins of the Eurasian Union the Economic Union Summit in Minsk at the weekend. And he was deliberately asked about the decision by NATO member states to drastically increase their defense expenditure. And he immediately got into this whole narrative that Russia is not the one that is aggressive. Russia was deceived over NATO enlargement. The West staged a coup in Ukraine in 2014, and it prevented the implementation of the subsequent Minsk agreements. And Russia at the same time is planning to cut its defense expenditure. And the Europeans are increasing theirs, and it's all to the advantage of the American defense industry. I mean, I could almost sort of recite that myself, give the speech myself. We've heard it in different forms many, many times before. But why is he saying this still in this way? Who is he actually addressing?
First of all, Vladimir Putin himself personally regularly participates in so-called active measures, активные мероприятия, or information psychological campaigns against the West. And his speech in Minsk, in my opinion, was part of the active measures, because Russia's long-term approach is focused on division of Europe and the United States. But after the NATO summit, Russia realized that Europe and the United States, they are united in terms of defense, in terms of understanding the threats, and so on and so on. And that NATO is not weak politically and organizationally. NATO is strong enough, and Putin just tried to make this division again, to restore this division between Europe and the United States. He tried to argue European elites, some European elites, there are some governments in Europe which are trying to communicate with Moscow, trying to make business as usual, for instance, and so on and so on. And his speech was a part of information psychological campaign against Europe. Guys, we are not a threat. We are not going to conquer you. And so on, so on, so on. But this speech was a complete pure lie, because Russian defense spending, we know them very well. Not very well. We don't know what they will be at the end of this year, but they are planned to be as 13.5 trillion rubles, and next year they are planned to be about 13 trillion rubles. And in 2027, they are planned to be about 13 trillion rubles. And so the reality will be different, because in 2022, 2024, all the original plans were revised. And the final military spending always were much higher than they were planned. Probably this year we will see the same situation. So the Russian military spending will be higher than 13.5 trillion rubles, probably.
So Putin's argument that Russia is going to be reducing defense spending is simply not true if you look at the data. That's what you're saying.
It's not true because there is a law. The Russian federal budget for 2025 and for the prospect of 2026, 2027. It's a law. And there is no any reduction.
But could this, I take your point that this is in the program, this is what is planned, and the budget allocations will be made when we get to that point. But could Putin not genuinely be thinking that he's going to achieve a victory in Ukraine? And at that point, it simply won't be necessary to spend as much money on defense because he won't be fighting a war in the same way.
Russia cannot win in Ukraine because Russia's purposes in the war against Ukraine are the following. First of all, it's elimination of Ukrainian statehood, elimination of Ukrainian culture, and damage of NATO. And the fourth purpose is establishing a new world order. Russia declared this. We can remember the Russian ultimatum of December 2021, ultimatum to NATO. Russia was not able to achieve these goals in 2022-2024, and Russia does not have resources to achieve these purposes this year or next year or in next 5 years. And Russia's economic state and military capacity, they are deteriorating. And we may compare what was Russia in, I don't know, February 2022 and what is Russia now. It's completely different systems.
There's a big difference, but it still doesn't change the fact that I actually understand completely the argument you're making, and I agree that this is not a winnable war in the terms that you describe. But in Putin's mind, it's quite possible to believe that he can exhaust the Ukrainians, that the West no longer has the resolve to support Ukraine in the previous way, and that it will, and that Trump is his friend in this process, and he is going to be able to impose a settlement on Ukraine, which he, for his purposes, can call a victory. I mean, I don't think that is fantastical.
You know, according to the Russian military doctrine, the only criteria for combat victory is elimination of adversaries' troops or disintegration of them. Mm-hmm. And in these terms, the last Russia's victory on the battlefield took place in Mariupol in May 2022. Mm-hmm. After that, Russia was trying to repeat this success. Russia was trying to encirclement of significant group of Ukrainian forces and to defeat them in Avdiivka, in Bakhmut, in Vuhledar, in Avdiivka, in Pokrovsk, and Russia has not been able to achieve this purpose yet. And generally speaking, Russia was trying to repeat, the situation of Ilovaisk in August 2014 and Debaltseve in February 2015, when after this defeat, Russia was able to force Ukraine to sign Minsk First Agreement and Minsk Second Agreement. Without this combat victory, Russia is not able even to sign a ceasefire agreement. because the political conditions are not favorable for Russia.
Correct. So in your analysis, this war is going to go on for a good while yet. Putin is to try to achieve his objective.
I try not to dig deeply in Putin's mind and in Putin's head. I know that we deal with Russia as a political economy system. And I describe Russia's system as not, a personalistic dictatorship, but as a complicated authoritarian regime with a group of people. And these people are ideologically motivated. They believe that they need to restore Russian Empire / Soviet Union. They need to fix the historical mistakes, historical errors of 20th century, and so on and so on. They do have ideological motivation. And we all know that when people thinks in strict ideological framework, this framework always defines their rationality. And they are rational, but within their ideological framework. And this ideological framework contradicts to the reality more and more, step by step. And unfortunately, the only way to change this mind is Russia's defeat. Russia should be defeated. Russia can be defeated, and Russia must be defeated, in my opinion. That's the only way to eliminate Russia's threat, not only to Ukraine but also to Europe.
Understood. I want to get back, Pavel, to the issue again of NATO. And one of the things I'm struck by in the sort of discourse in Europe is that there's a real fear that the United States is no longer committed to Article 5 in the way that it was. And at the same time, there's on the part of our political leaders, there's a strong desire to create the impression with our publics that the US is actually still on board. So, there's something of an ambivalent approach here, because you look at the case of Germany, which is now about to invest in really very significant rearmament. We have a German chancellor talking about the need for Germany to be a leading military power in Europe. And for Germans to say this, that reflects that we're in a very, very difficult situation. So how do you think the elites and the decision-making circles in Moscow read this? Do they really think there is still substance to NATO in terms of the US commitment? Or do they think that the organization is actually breaking up?
I think that after Israeli-Iran war, Moscow is reconsidering its understanding of NATO now and the role of the United States, because we may remember what was the discourse, I know, in May 2025 or in April 2025. Or Donald Trump is focused on domestic budgetary troubles, and Donald Trump is so chaotic, unpredictable, without any strategy. So America is weak and American leadership is gone. And when the United States needed to support Israel, United States came and supported Israel by air power, and America is still a leader of the West, and America will remain the Western leader.
Yeah, and you can add to that President Trump is unpredictable, to say the very least, because who would have thought that this isolationist president who campaigned on the ticket that the US should not involve itself in these distant conflicts, would in fact have the courage to bomb Iran. That was a big move. But Pavel, I want to move on. We have a question here from Samantha DeBendan from Chatham House, and she asks, do you have a reading of Moscow's reaction to the latest news from the US that Washington is going to halt the delivery of certain weapon systems to Ukraine? And do you have any view on the reaction to Macron's phone call with Putin on Tuesday?
Thank you, Samantha, for your questions. Let's start from the end. Macron's call. It was not the first Macron's call to Moscow during the last several years. And usually these calls change nothing and influence on nothing. I do not pay attention to these calls because it is not a tool how you can manage problems or how you can solve some issues and so on and so on. Towards the recent issue with American military aid. First of all, this freeze is, it is not good in terms of communications, because it was sudden and different American agencies didn't know what is going on. So this is a problem of public communications. This is a problem of communications within the current administration of the United States. But in terms of military things, this freeze is not crucial. I mean, and it is not painful for Ukrainian armed forces. And also, we knew since, summer 2024, when there was a presidential campaign in the United States, we knew that Trump's administration does not like blank checks, does not like aid. United States current administration wants that someone pays for the military aid besides American taxpayers. And
but, Pavel, let's look at it the other way here. For Ukraine, just at the moment when Russia has been increasing its air campaign to demoralize Ukrainian citizens, at that precise moment, the US, having said that it would look into providing further supplies of Patriot missiles, suddenly withdraws or suspends its support. I mean, if you're sitting in Moscow thinking about how this war might end or how you can bring it to an end, you surely have to think that this is very helpful. Just at the moment you need
it. It's not helpful because, first of all, air terror campaigns usually do not bring desirable planned results, because the concept of air terror campaign is false. It's a complete false, psychopathic concept, but it doesn't work. Also, back to the objective reality. The production rates of Patriot missiles is low enough, not because of United States does not want to produce more, but because of sophisticated technical nature of these missiles. You cannot produce thousands of them a year. You can produce only a couple of hundreds or maximum several hundreds missiles a year. And you do have you do have allied forces all around the world which need these missiles. Israel, American troops deployed in the Pacific region, European forces, allied monarchies of Persian Gulf. They also need protection, also need defense. And of course, Ukraine crucially needs on Patriot missiles, because these missiles are only missiles capable to intercept Russian ballistic tactical ballistic missiles like Iskander or Kinjal and so on. And even if Ukraine wants to buy more Patriot missiles, the production rates are low enough. That means that you should focus not on any single arrow, but you should focus on Archer. And that means that Ukraine may focus its missile defense on targeting of Russian launchers of missiles. And for these purposes, Ukraine needs assist from Europe and from the United States in production of Ukrainian-made tactical ballistic missiles or intermediate range ballistic missiles. And in this way, Ukraine will be capable to hit Iskander launchers and to hit Russian air bases.
Okay, we have another question that's come in here from Roger Golland, who asks, where should we look for the first signs of fracture in the Russian edifice? So in this sort of Russian foundation of power, where do you think that might be?
We saw first time we saw this in June 2023, 2 years ago, during the Prigozhin's mutiny. Because for me, the most surprising fact was that people in the headquarters of the South Military District were not going to execute their duty. They just gave up the headquarters to Prigozhin. Because they didn't have a proper order. But if your military are not going to execute their duty without an order, you do have a problem. And we see that the deterioration of Russia is going on. It's not so fast. There is a huge institutional inertia within Russia. But I think that this deterioration is irreversible. Russia is on the way to the failed state. And I cannot predict when Russia will cross the border, but it will be. Because
so just looking at this issue, for example, of the dissatisfaction within the military system, we know that before the war, for example, General Ivashov, there was another general whose name I forget now. They published warnings that the Russian army, correct, that the Russian army would get bogged down in Ukraine, and in many ways their analysis has proved to be absolutely correct. And you couldn't accuse Ivashov of being a dove when it came to Russia's national interests, quite on the contrary. So where does, assuming there is still this frustration and disagreement with the strategy in the Russian military system, where might that be expressed? Where would we see it expressed?
There is a huge generational gap within the Russian officer corps. It's the current generals who are the last Soviet-era officers who graduated from military academies in late 1980s, early 1990s. They got they got the Marxist framework in their heads, but at least this is a kind of philosophical framework. The new generations of Russian officers, current colonels who are commanders of motor rifle brigades and so on, they are post-Soviet officers. They don't have any philosophical framework, but they have ambitions. And the generals, they understood. Maybe not all of them, but some of them. They understood since the very beginning of the war that the war is disastrous. And now there is a question: who will be responsible for the outcomes of the war? And colonels are not going to be responsible, and generals are not going to be responsible. There will be a kind of political clash. There would be. I don't know whether or not it will be, but there would be a kind of political clash inside the officer corps. Who will be responsible? And this clash would have a kind of damage to the Russian military capabilities, organizational damage to the Russian military capabilities as well. Because when people will think not about how to execute the order on the battlefield, but how to avoid the responsibility, it would be a very interesting situation.
It's going to be fascinating to see how that plays out and where we might see more evidence of this gap that you're describing. Pavel, on that fascinating note, we need to finish because we're out of time. I want to thank you for joining us today, and to remind our listeners, our viewers, that we'll be back again at the same time next week. We hope to see you there. Thank you very much, Pavel.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for your questions.